My name is Keith Bybee, and I direct the Institute for the Study of Judiciary, Politics, and the Media here at Syracuse University. And in conjunction with the Tully Center for Free Speech at Newhouse, directed by this strapping young man here, Roy Gutterman, we co-sponsor a lecture series every spring on law, politics, and the media. It's associated with a law, politics, and media course that enrolls students from Law, Maxwell, and Newhouse. As part of this series, we bring in distinguished practitioners who discuss issues at the intersection of law, politics, and the media. We often hear from judges and journalists, and today we're fortunate enough to hear from a distinguished lawyer who is also a policymaker, who's a legislator, and has been involved in politics for a number of years. Our speaker is Tom Buckel, who is a partner at Hancock and Easterbrook. He is a lawyer with 30 years of experience prosecuting and defending, litigating issues from a very wide range. He, in 2007, was elected to the Onondaga County Legislature, where he still serves. He has had first-hand experience with the intersection of law and politics, and some exposure also to reporters in the media. And we were lucky enough to lure him away from his two jobs to speak with us today. As is our practice, the lecture will last, including question and answer, for an hour. And at 5 o'clock, we will break for a small reception, and I invite all of you to remain after the conclusion of the lecture to continue the conversation over refreshments. Please join me in welcoming Tom Buckel.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the Institute for having me. I'm honored to be here. To be a teacher for at least an hour is a great privilege. I want to acknowledge a couple things. First, I actually have 3 jobs, and the third is that of a father, and I have a freshman at Syracuse University who happened to sneak out of his busy schedule to join us today. So my son is here, and I'm very thrilled about that. There's somebody else I want to acknowledge. You know, all politics is local, they say, but Syracuse University was privileged to have one of the great scholars in our nation that talks or handles one of the subjects that I will talk about, and that's Ralph Ketchum, who I had the honor of taking a course from many years ago, and I'm just thrilled to see you here today. Thank you for coming. And I know he's going to see if I learned anything over the years. My topic today is the role of local government in the Federalist system. I present this from the perspective of a local government official. I intend to first review, in general, the sources of authority under our constitutional scheme of local governments, and then I'll drill down a little bit deeper and talk about local government in Onondaga County in particular, or in general, and then the county government in particular. And finally, I'll review some challenges and some issues that I think we need to confront as potential policymakers in the Federalist system. And I'm going to begin with what I think is a significant dichotomy. And that is this: local governments throughout history have been revered as beacons of democracy and the places where government most directly affect people. And in one of the readings I recommended from Tocqueville, he even refers to local governments as having been created by the hand of God. And if you look at that, realistically, I think what he meant was that the associations formed on the local level are some of the strongest, most meaningful, significant natural associations we have. And the dichotomy is this, that despite their importance and their reverence throughout history, local governments occupy a sort of constitutional netherrealm in our system. The Constitution, after all, is largely silent on local governments. I think as close as it comes would be the 10th Amendment, which, as you probably know, says, in essence, that the powers not delegated in the Constitution to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. And the Supreme Court captured the place of local government in a case of Community Communications versus Boulder, a 1982 case, where it said, and I quote, Ours is a dual system of government, which has no place for sovereign cities. As this court stated long ago, all sovereign authority within the geographical limits of the United States resides either with the government of the United States or with the states of the Union. There exists within the broad domain of sovereignty but these two. There may be cities, counties, and other organized bodies with limited legislative functions, but they are all derived from or exist in subordination to one or the other of the federal government or the states. And so it is here in New York. New York State gives local governments a substantial degree of lawmaking authority. Here it's called home rule. It's an expression used in our state constitution. It's an expression used consistently by local government officials to describe their powers. It enables us, home rule that is, enables us to take actions over a very wide range of issues that our constituents, local citizens desire, without having to run to the state for authorization. Things like libraries, water, the fire protection, police, roads, sanitation, the core functions we think of as local government. Home rule allows us to organize as we see fit. In Onondaga County, we use this authority to create a unified executive office led by an elected county executive. And this executive oversees about 3,700 employees in dozens of different agencies and departments. We also have an elected legislature, of which I'm a member, that essentially makes policy and passes budgets. Finally, this home rule in New York allows us certain authority over limited forms of taxation to finance just not only local needs, but to meet the increasingly strict demands of the federal and state regulatory structure that I'll talk about in a minute. In Onondaga County, our primary means of raising money are the property tax, sales taxes, certain types of transaction fees such as charges for water or hotel room occupancy fees, or some of the many charges you see on your cell phone bills or TV cable bills. Now, it's often the case that something we want to do as a local official clashes with state law. When that happens, the Court of Appeals has held when a local law results in a situation where what would be permissible under state law becomes a violation of local law, a conflict exists and local law must give way. I bring this up today because we recently had such a conflict in the case of hydrofracking, an issue that certainly is on the minds of policymakers in upstate New York and was written about extensively in the New York Times recently. This is the controversial drilling practice that affects a stretch of land throughout the southern tier of New York and Pennsylvania and other places. I sought earlier this year, or last year, to pass a local law banning hydrofracking in Onondaga County because of concerns that have been described over threats to the watershed. But I learned that in the case of gas drilling, the state employs what you would call, and I call, the MC Hammer principle. You can't touch that. Because the state environmental conservation law bans all local laws or ordinances that affect hydrofracking or natural gas drilling. We are powerless as local governments to prevent or regulate hydrofracking in our territories, although some nearby communities, as you've probably read about, have tried to carve out some local power to do it based on an exception in the law for, quote, local roads or, quote, zoning. I know it might be a shock to you to hear that politicians sometimes pass laws that they know can't be enforced, but it does happen. And just this week, a local town, Fabius, south of here, passed a moratorium on hydrofracking earlier this week. But it is unlikely that that law or any local law passed by a town or a village or a city, if and when challenged in court, will be upheld, at least under a 1982 case from the court from Erie County, which the court said environmental conservation law trumps any local law over gas drilling, period. No exceptions. So on the other hand, New York courts have come to reject findings of conflict where the local law merely attempts to strengthen or add to what is already on the books on the state. And this is consistent with both our federal and our state constitutional structure, where the rights set out in the Bill of Rights are not defined as being exclusive and all-encompassing. And in some cases in the state constitution, the rights therein are stronger than the federal constitution. Now I bring this up, again, to bring it home to something else in the news, because the New York State Constitution guarantees the right of all employees to organize and bargain collectively, something that we read about very much in the news today. So if the New York governor or the legislature or even a local government attempted to impact or alter collective bargaining rights in the public sector, there would be a conflict with a constitutional provision that obviously would be addressed by the courts. If we had more time, I'd talk about some of the, what I think is the strange New York constitutional jurisprudence that has been applied to these, but that's the subject for another day. Now, before I move on to some nitty-gritty details about local government, I want to mention some areas where the view of local government as a unitary creature of the state breaks down, because this is tied to what I think is one of the monumental accomplishments of the Syracuse University Law School. By way of background, the courts in some limited cases, limited circumstances, have given local governments the power to resist the commands of the state in the name of federal power in some instances. There's a very modest form of localism embedded in the Supreme Court's jurisdiction that can be read to support local autonomy from the state when certain kinds of equal protection guarantees are involved. For instance, the courts have held that municipalities are not cloaked with complete sovereign immunity under civil rights claims or equal protection claims under Section 1983. States are immune from such suits, but local governments are not. And this is where the Syracuse University Law Clinic comes into play. Because in 1985, pretrial detainees and inmates in our local jail filed a class action lawsuit against Onondaga County under Section 1983 in the local district court, seeking declaratory relief and injunctive relief to reduce jail populations to levels they contended then would be constitutional. And those inmates were represented by the Syracuse University Law Clinic. 3 years later, in 1988, the district court found, based on the representation of the clinic, that the local jail conditions were unconstitutional and ordered that a population cap be imposed on the existing jail and that the county submit a plan to remedy the constitutional violations. And so that plan called for, eventually, the construction of a new jail, which was, in fact, built. This, in my view, is one of the great accomplishments of this clinic, and in my view stands as a testament to the value of clinical legal education, not just for students in the school, but obviously society at large. And that value, by the way, as my colleagues on the legislature will remind me, involved 3 years of litigation defense costs and about $55 million to build the new jail. Most of it was paid for in local money. So now with that as background, what do we use our home rule authority and the occasional autonomy that the federal government bestows on us to do? Why are local governments important? And here, I think, again, Tocqueville got it right, where he wrote, "Local institutions form a complete and regular whole. They are ancient. Law, and even more, makes them strong, and they exercise immense influence over the whole of society. For all these reasons, they deserve our attention." Well, I believe that, actually with the zeal of a convert, that is as true today as it was 170, 180 years ago. Today, local governments here and throughout the nation are involved in federal state, and local questions that implicate concerns such as where and how people live, public safety, work conditions, wages, the environment, education, transportation, and social service, to name just a few of the things. Local governments across the spectrum, including counties, have begun, and over the last several generations have taken on concerns that are typically thought of as national. Political reform, public health, employment relations, domestic relations. How many cities do you know of, or have you heard, that have passed ordinances concerning gay marriage or discrimination, or barring discrimination of other forms? In public health, initiatives from the local level across the nation have included stringent indoor smoking controls, regulation of tobacco, restrictions on the use of trans fats, regulation of the requirements that restaurants or chain restaurants disclose their calorie contents. We've done some of these things in Onondaga County. We passed local laws that ban smoking in bars and restaurants. About a year ago, or a couple of years ago, we passed a local law that bans smoking within 100 feet of any hospital. City of Syracuse enacted a living wage legislation calling for the payment of wages in particular types of transactions higher than the standard minimum wage. Now, in addition to this, the vast majority of public employees, those employees in the news, yes, those covered by collective bargaining agreements, are employed by local governments. And the vast majority for the opportunities to participate in public life, such as running for office, or campaigning for or against a ballot proposition, or appearing before governing institutions, such as the school board, or the zoning board, or the town meeting, occur on the local level. Spending. State and local governments' direct spending on domestic policy is greater than spending by the federal government. In Onondaga County, we have a community of 450,000 people. Total local government spending is $3 billion. It's a staggering sum of money. Where do we spend it? Let's start with education. We have 72,000 students, kindergartens through grade 12, 18 school districts, total budgets of about $1.25 billion. County government, $1.2 billion. City of Syracuse, about $300 million. 18 towns collectively, $170 million. 15 villages, $85 million. 20 independent fire districts, $18 million. And these entities also collectively bear long-term debt of $1.3 billion. And these statistics don't account for things like industrial development agencies, public authorities, and housing authorities, cooperative educational services, many of which have independent borrowing and spending capacity. So how do we pay for all this in this community of 450,000 people? About $850 million comes collectively from all the property taxes imposed by various levels of government. Another $320 million comes from things like sales taxes, utility taxes, franchise fees, surcharges for emergency management services. And if you do the math, that's less than half of the total countywide expenditures for government services. Another $825 million comes from state grants, mostly from education. About $200 million, $225 million from federal aid, although is substantially higher in the last 2 years due to stimulus money and Medicaid assistance provided by the federal government. And we have a host of other local fees and surcharges to fill the gaps. Let me focus for a minute on the $1.2 billion we spend in the county. Our key areas of responsibility are things like maintaining records, county clerk's office, land, financial, birth records. We run elections. We administer welfare, health, social services programs, sheriff, a jail, probation. We support local courts. We provide indigent defense services, juvenile justice facilities, emergency management, the 911 center, the 911 number that you'll call on an emergency. We plow those roads when it snows. Education, including some support of the primary and secondary schools, and a community college that we fund in part. Parks, recreation, culture, environmental programs, water services, drainage, sanitation, convention center, housing programs, support for certain agricultural and food systems, and family nutrition programs, natural resource managements. So while each of these can be said to be local, I mean, jails are a great example. These are a jail. The local jail is something that's been a county function since medieval England. Each one of these functions is very deeply intertwined with policies that the federal and state government have passed. You know, I mentioned earlier how federal constitutional and statutory authority provides certain baseline standards of fairness that bind and sometimes even empower local governments. But there's other federal policies set the context in which we can exercise local power. In the New York Times today, there was a story about how the tax extension, the tax deal signed into law by President Obama recently, included a provision for accelerated depreciation that will cost states and localities hundreds of millions of dollars, because many states throughout the country tie their tax provisions to the federal government. It was an unintended consequence, but one that will be significant. There was something in the news here recently about federal authorization given to the Destiny Mall project for these green bonds. For those that don't know the background, in 2002, the Destiny Mall owners applied for and proposed a grand expansion of their mall. It was going to become like the green mecca of America. It was going to be this magnificent, extravagant project built on contaminated land and powered by renewable energy and packed with all sorts of energy-saving technology. The owners of the mall happened to be very powerful political players, and after enlisting the support of most local officials, they applied for and lobbied Congress to grant them special tax benefits so they could finance the mall expansion. The result was the authorization of these things called green bonds, which were going to be used to help finance the expansion. Now, the owners got an enormous windfall, and some have calculated the windfall at about $120 million over the 30-year life of these bonds. And the deal was also important to institutional investors and wealthy individuals who buy these bonds because they don't have to pay tax on them. Well, here's the rub. It turns out that several years later, these green bonds have been a bust for taxpayers. The local newspaper reported that none of the so-called green features that we thought we were financing as taxpayers have materialized. We don't have any solar panels out there. No fuel cells, no windmills, and no biofuel powered generators. And the project seems to be going nowhere, as you can see if you drive by it. And now Destiny's lawyers, citing significant changes in the economy, are trying to persuade the IRS that they meant well. Please let us keep these benefits even though it didn't pan out. Stay tuned. We don't know how the IRS will decide. And I talk about this because this is an example of how a discrete project can be shaped by something the federal government does. But even something widely available as a deduction for home interest mortgage profoundly affects how we do things on the local level. We live in a region, for instance, that's been described by some scholars as having one of the worst sprawl rates in the country, meaning our population is declining, but we are building homes further and further away from our metropolitan core. And this causes us to spend more money on roads and sewers and drainage and fire and police service. And if the deduction for home mortgage interest was eliminated, it would have a profound impact on a region such as ours by removing incentives to build new homes further and further away from the industrial, the metropolitan core. So, beyond that, states generally rely on counties, such as Onondaga, to implement federal and state health and welfare programs. our costs of administering programs such as temporary assistance and food stamps, some of the just aid to the disabled. Collectively, these are one of the largest groups of expenses we have in Onondaga County. I think the first, largest group of expenses is public safety. The next is the administration of these social service programs. Federal environmental laws are significant, and they intertwine very directly with our land use laws, affecting how we treat wetlands, how we treat waterways, where we can build homes, where we can build offices. We in Onondaga County are in the midst of a $1 billion program to restore the ecological health and recreational uses of Onondaga Lake and its watershed, in part in response to a lawsuit alleging violations of federal environmental laws. Onondaga County contributed to the pollution of the lake through outdated and inadequate sewage and drainage systems, and we're in the process of reconstructing these systems at an enormous cost. In my 2 terms on the county legislature, we've enacted programs that deal with homeland security, criminal justice, education, employment, housing, telecommunications, transportation, and other environmental policies. Federal policy, for instance, concerning homeland security required us to spend almost $50 million to put protective caps and coverings on reservoirs of drinking water. And this leads to the next aspect of the relationships between federal, state, and local governments we hear about. This word called mandates. Counties and other local governments, especially in areas related to the environment and human services and public safety, are often required by the federal or state government to either do certain things or to pay for certain things. Now, this term I use carefully because it's often used, the word mandate is often used by local government officials as this catch-all excuse for anything that somebody doesn't like. You know, why did you raise taxes? Well, we had to because of mandates. Why did you, change that program? Mandates. Why did the snowplow drive into my car? Well, it was mandates. And you'll hear this like a mantra constantly. If you tune into it, anytime you hear a local politician talking about local government, it comes up. It came up last night when Joni Mahoney gave her address, and it's always used. But it is important to dissect it. The one that we talk about the most often, the one that affects us tremendously, is the obligation of the county in New York State to pay the state's share of Medicaid. Medicaid, as you may know, is a federally created program that the federal government monitors, and the state actually runs the programs. And New York happens to provide a more generous scheme of benefits to Medicaid recipients, especially in areas concerning the elderly and disabled. But in New York, unlike many states, localities and the counties are required to pay 25% of the state share. So last year, our share in Onondaga County of Medicaid costs was about $95 million. And that was net of, I think, $12 to $15 million in federal Medicaid assistance money we received. So it's obviously a very significant, large expense. It's not the only mandate. Things such as foster care, dealing with juvenile delinquents and their care and boarding, handicap, the education of handicapped children, indigent counsel, assigned counsel, certain types of Centro. We have obligations imposed on us that we must pay for, lest we lose other federal assistance or lest we, run into other, sanctions from the federal or state government. But what do these do to us? I want to shift a little bit, describe where that leaves us today, because I think what's happening here is very representative of what's going on in other counties in the state and across the nation. The recession caused substantial increases in our expenditures here on the local level. Onondaga County experienced increases in welfare caseloads for the first time since the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. The number of food stamp recipients increased dramatically. Medicaid enrollment expanded. Not only that, both the federal and the state governments expanded eligibility requirements for many of these programs to meet the basic human needs that the recession imposed on us. And we pay our portions of this increased eligibility, or we risk losing programs and federal assistance. So in the face of these responsibilities, in addition to our own local responsibilities, we are strapped for cash, just as the federal government and the state government are strapped. On the local level, because of the stock market losses, we have underfunded or unfunded pension obligations that we have to make up for our public employees. The real estate bust caused our region and regions throughout the country to experience declines in real estate values, which led to declines in real property tax revenues. New York State, as you may or may not know, has very high levels of property and sales taxes, meaning that it's difficult for us to draw on new sources of revenue to fund not only our local services, but those that are intertwined with federal and state policy. Sales taxes range between 7 and 9%. And while sales taxes are starting to increase after huge declines in the last 2 years, most of them are fueled by higher gas prices, which in turn result in higher fuel costs for all those snowplows you see out there. And so we confront potential future losses of sales tax as more and more business is done on the internet, at least until Congress and the Supreme Court straighten out their policy of who can tax for what transactions and where. So as we read every day, attempting to balance the federal budget while simultaneously reducing the debt is a major priority of the current Congress. And New York, like most states, confronts massive revenue shortfalls in its own right. Some people estimate $10 to $12 billion. So I believe that the next decade, not just immediately, but over the next decade, local governments are going to experience substantial decreases in federal and state resources that are available to them. And at the same time, our own local expenses increase. So as a result, I think counties and local governments are going to be challenged to develop innovative solutions to meet an expanded demand for services using less revenue and resources. What does that mean for us here in upstate New York? We have to rethink both the legal and the institutional capabilities of counties and local governments. In Onondaga County, we have 18 school districts, 18 towns, 15 villages, a city, a county, independent fire, and other districts. Do we need them all? Is there a better way to govern locally? I, for one, have been a very passionate advocate for combining and consolidating and modernizing these functions. Let me offer you a thought experiment. What if we had one county-wide school district managed by an independent board of trustees instead of 18 districts with 18 separate superintendents and 18 separate school boards? While I do not advocate eliminating collective bargaining, one of the challenges we confront in Onondaga County is that we have all these units of government confronting separate bargaining representatives, resulting in wide-ranging levels of wages or benefits or work roles that are inconsistent sometimes one town to another. And I submit to you that this is also a very critically important time to focus on the eternal federalist question that Professor Ketchum has studied and taught so many years, and that is this: how should power be shared? How should Congress decide, or how should we decide, from a policy standpoint, what things are best left for the federal government and what things are best given to the states or directly to the local governments? I think as we think through things, there are areas where uniformity is essential. I think we can think of environmental areas where something originated in one state harms another, that there's the need for federal involvement. There are some solutions, although I know this is controversial here in my own world, where states find that they can't regulate things because they're all in a competition with each other, which I characterize as the race to the bottom. I mean, states, localities across the nation are competing with each other to give out benefits and other inducements to draw on business and relax regulations, so that it may be that only the federal government can step in those cases to do something that secures the common good. But on the other hand, and this is, again, the eternal debate, there are areas that are peculiarly local, where people in different parts of the country see things or view things, and have a perspective that's different, and it's hard to create general rules. But let me expand a little bit more on the federal government's role in all this as it pertains to where we are today. Another reason why next year is going to be significantly worse for us in Onondaga County and pretty much every state and local government across the country is because the federal stimulus aid to states and localities comes to an end. And I know, at least if you know something different, please tell me, but I haven't heard anyone in Washington who has the political will or thinks there is a will in Washington or has the votes to change this, to extend it over the course of the next several years. So what we did over the past 2 years, and what the stimulus money and aid to Medicaid allowed us to do, is to maintain our current levels of service and to some extent our current employment levels, although we did make some cuts. And in some instances, we had to increase the level of expenditures to meet the needs of the recessions, especially in social services. But in the process, we built ourselves a higher and higher cliff, off of which we will fall when the stimulus and Medicaid aid ends in just a few months. So that doesn't mean that the stimulus program was bad. Far from it. It saved my county, and I believe it saved states and localities across the nation, and allowed us to provide services that were needed because of the demands of this recession. At a time of the greatest human need, we were, in fact, able to provide some baseline level of services to the most vulnerable citizens. But on the other hand, I think it highlights a disconnect between what happens in Washington and what goes on in the states and in the local governments. And that disconnect is that over the years, the federal government has paid a very small percentage of the essential government programs that it requires us to perform, despite what you might read in these congressional and Senate press releases about their earmarks and the other federal goodies that our representatives bring back to us. Now, we used to have, going back to the Nixon administration, something called revenue sharing. There was then a scholar in the White House, a former Maxwell professor named Pat Moynihan, who later served as the United States Senator from New York, who came to the conclusion that the federal government was a better tax collector, a more efficient collector of revenue than the state and local governments, but that the state and local governments were better at administering social services. So they created a revenue sharing program in which the federal government essentially distributed money to the states each year for them to use as they saw fit in meeting local needs. It was modified over time to provide money directly to local governments. And that program died throughout the 1980s, and today nobody in Washington is talking about the problems of the states and local governments. It's just the opposite. The talk is about eliminating further stimulus or other aids to the states and localities and continuing to pare down and even decimate the federal government's ability to raise revenue. We recently saw how difficult it was to accomplish something that I would characterize as unthreatening and as significant as restoring at least the modestly higher tax rates for wealthier individuals that were in effect during the Clinton administration. I think that tells you something about our culture and our politics and about the deficiencies of modern politics in light of the seriousness of the financial problems all levels of government face. But that disconnect is not just from the federal government. We also are witnessing an interesting reaction from some states to federal assistance. There's a trend of some states saying, I don't want your money. The Wall Street Journal had a story just yesterday where the headline was, Washington minus dollars equals plus for the states. And the author was trying to advocate the sense that this whole structure of money coming from you with some strings attached to it from the federal government to the states, let's reject it. We hear talk of states rejecting the health care money. We hear states, some are even suggesting, we no longer even want your Medicaid money, even though the program is structured in a way that that authority isn't given to them. So I think that in light of these tensions, which go back to the basic Federalist question, how should power be shared? But these dynamics are bringing us to a point where, given local government's role in administering programs, federal and state, given that every state and locality is facing enormous financial problems, given that the federal government is facing enormous financial challenges as well, that revenues are limited, perhaps maxed out on the state level, I think it's time, at least, to rethink the federal government's role in our overall financial structure. I don't know that revenue sharing is the answer any more than I know whether refusing federal aid is the answer. But given what I see as a breakdown in our political system, which I'd love to talk about another time, I think that this issue, that these problems have to come first from the world of ideas, meaning that it probably has to come from you and the here and now. We fundamentally have to re-examine our federal system in this country, including how we pay for and administer programs. You know, the federal government and the state governments cannot continue to pass programs and mandate expenditures when we don't have sufficient money to pay for it. Or do the very seductive thing by offering a program that says, hey, if you do this, we'll match your expenditure dollar for dollar. We do this all the time on the county level, and it's very easy. No politician in a democracy can afford to turn down that kind of offer. And that's what helped keep the level of spending at all levels higher, these sort of dollar for dollar grant programs. So I think a restructuring has to happen. And though I'm not confident in our political structure to make it happen, I am confident that this is something you and your professors will write about and help drive the change. I said I'd talk for 45 minutes, and let me conclude. I want to comment a little bit about what we hear in the news about bitterness directed to politicians on the federal, state, and local legislatures. Is our system broken in many ways? Absolutely it is. Subject for another time. But today I want to comment on these widespread anger that legislators have failed to do the jobs, that we're not passing budgets, that we're irresponsible and corrupt and all these other things. Based on my experience, again, I'm on a local level, but we have, I think, 400 elected officials in Onondaga County, so I've come across a few and been able to make judgments. But based on my experience, most people who are in these legislatures went into politics because they want to do good things for people. To many like me, it was a social worker impulse. And to many, for all of our history, it was a way of moving up the economic and social ladder. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some of our greatest and most extraordinary politicians, if you think recently Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, and historically Abe Lincoln, were motivated in part by those ambitions. But we all went into politics when the challenge, just like it was today, was how do we confer better education on kids? How do we confer better health care to more people? How do we confront the enormous challenges of so many of our neighbors living in poverty? How do we take advantage of the extraordinary technological changes that science brings to us every generation. But for most of our history, that responding to those challenges involved public spending. And all of a sudden, we are confronted with the realities that I've described to you today, and it's very difficult, as well as painful, for elected officials like me to deal with it, primarily because we are represented, or we are elected to represent our constituents' interests, and our constituents perceive their interests largely to be a continuation of existing levels of spending. So again, another eternal question in a democracy. Are you elected to represent your constituents, or are you elected to pursue some greater good, some greater value? Or how do you measure the two? But the point is, I think that these politicians are not necessarily the bad guys. We are hurt by the fact that the economic paradigm in this nation and in this state and in our region has changed, and that the political paradigms have not changed to reflect the situation. So I think it's a very fascinating time to examine and think about and talk about the challenges of public service in our federal system and the interrelationships of the federal, state, and local governments. And I really hope that a very healthy percentage of people in this room will consider public service as options. I know there's 3 schools represented here, and I don't think there's any better training to confront these kind of challenges than what you're receiving in the law school and Newhouse and Maxwell. God knows we need people in government who can dissect a problem, assess data, understand the pros and cons of different points of view. And if you can't do these things accurately and honestly, then we're never going to find solutions that work. So I want to conclude at this point for questions to tell you I do have faith in you, and I have faith in these just remarkable institutions that you represent today to find these solutions, and I thank you for the chance to be here today. Love to take any questions. Professor.
Tom, you think Jefferson's idea was that self-government in a republic wouldn't work unless the local units were really good and strong. That's why he always went back to state and local institutions, and because the whole thing wouldn't generate enough public energy in favor of the system and enough constructive input and so on, unless it was strong at the local level. Do you think Jefferson would be disappointed where we are now?
I think he would be fairly pleased at the way local governments are organized because of the things I talked about at the beginning, the opportunities for engagement. That really is the place where citizens are truly engaged for the same things that Tocqueville said. I mean, these are where the relationships are the strongest. And, let me just kind of veer off a little bit. At lunch today, some of the students were talking about, well, what is it like on the local level? How do you see and perceive what you do compared to what might be done on the national level? And the thing that struck me as I thought about that was that I, as a local official, have much deeper, widespread, and significant relationships with the people I interact with every day. My opponents, my constituents, the executive branch. And those relationships, I think, are so vital to the civic health of our nation. Putnam wrote about it, but I think it's found here. And that's one of the things I think is missing. If we talk about deficiencies in what our political structure today, because of this extraordinary polarization, this contest, this blood contest over power that drives politicians to work just 3 days a week in Washington, the Tuesday through Thursday rules now. I think they've lost the opportunity to form the kind of relationships to work on meaningful solutions, because the levels of what, as I was growing up, a partisan was somebody that voted with his party 60% of the time. Today it's 90, or else you are sanctioned. So I go back to the kinds of things we can do locally and just the fundamental civic bonds I think it's powerful, and I think he'd be happy at the structures we have. I don't know whether 50 governments in Onondaga County for 450,000 people is quite the Jeffersonian ideal, but the way we interact and respond to people, I do think would be something he'd be thrilled with.
But just to add one more thing, you mentioned that one of the problems you have as a legislature is that your constituency out there is only interested in how much they can get from the system and keep the payments that are coming in and so on. You state that as though it's a problem for the legislator because of the deficiency of the constituency. Do we have to worry about that deficiency?
Should we worry about 50% of our public high school students dropping out of the city schools? Yeah. Damn right we should. Does that translate? I mean, what's the old adage that I once heard? Somebody says, you know, it's frustrating for those lawyers, those A students in law school to have to interpret laws made by the C students. But you're trying to turn that around. So, yeah. I find both as a trial lawyer that presents matters to jurors and tries to draw them out, as a public official, that people are far more informed than given credit for. I know that is kind of counter-cultural in a way, but what I meant was it's not people being, you know, dumb or selfish, but we all have interests that we have to protect. You know, just making a living in some cases, making sure your kids have got education, making sure your road's plowed. And these are not demands bred in ignorance or selfishness. It's just, I think, life. And if I'm representing these people, they want those things. And I think that I need to fight for them as their elected official to ensure that their road is plowed and their kids are educated and, you know, God forbid they lose their job, they're not going to be, you know, wandering the streets. So,
You described things about the drilling for gas, how there's a conflict between the law that you want to pass locally and state law. When there's conflicts like that, is it pretty much like a, oh well, guess game over, or is there ever like a fight? Would you go to courts? Or when things like that happen, do you find yourself collaborating with neighboring counties, or do you find yourself in conflicts with neighboring counties?
I laughed when you said, because that's an issue that has caused me and our county attorney a great deal of conflict. In our legislature, we have to have the county attorney's, quote, approval for certain forms of legislation. And I tend to be a little bit on the reckless side, sometimes to make a point, because politicians do that. And I always, you know, the old saying is it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So I was, on hydrofracking, the environmental conservation law is really clear. All right? When it says, you know, like the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, that's just what it means. Local governments have no authority under the ECL to regulate hydrofracking. So how do we deal with it? Some have done the reckless thing that I advocate. Yeah, the hell with it, just do it, and we'll you know, interfere with the process. But you know, have we gotten together? Yes. Localities have, in fact, been very engaged, collectively working with the state to ensure that during the regulatory review process, our concerns are heard. We've asked for changes in the law. You know, I also want to point out, because if I don't, my good friend Melody from ESF and a graduate of this law school will, that although we're very fearful of the process and its impact on, potential impact on drinking water, there's some very strong scientific data and analysis that these concerns are way overwrought, not necessarily supported by the process. You know, it's interesting, on the one hand we have some people that deny climate change, but on the other hand we have others that say, well, we deny that science because we don't like it. But it's important, and I harken back to the training that you're getting, that we do rely on the data. And yes, we sometimes respond to the hysteria. That's sometimes it's a question of survival. But the data is important, and working collectively, as you suggested, is something we do. And occasionally the state reacts, and sometimes it doesn't. Yep, please.
Say a neighboring county, I don't know the other counties, but say a neighboring county, say you're collaborating with the other counties to try to go against the state legislation regarding that. And there's one county that says, no, we really need them to drill here. Like, do you tend to be in sync with the surrounding counties here?
Not as much as we should be. And I think on the issue of hydrofracking, if you ask public officials, I think that they're going to be all local officials are probably going to say, oh, I oppose it, or I want at least further study and further, because that seems to be the reaction of their constituents, the fear. And the reality is, the greatest resource we have in this area is fresh water. We sit in perhaps the most significant fresh water reservoir in the world, from the Great Lakes to the Adirondacks. And so those are genuine concerns. But from a planning and economic and development standpoint, we are woefully uncoordinated and need far more regional thinking in how we do things. We don't do it county to county. We don't even do it within Onondaga County. At lunch today, I mentioned how Onondaga County itself, in the face of these massive problems with sprawl, we don't have the authority over land use and planning. The individual silos in the forms of towns and villages and cities have that authority. So that if we say no more paving over farmland, we have too many vacant homes and vacant businesses and vacant buildings. We're virtually powerless as a region, as a county, to do anything about that. And that powerlessness extends county to county. And we should be thinking of upstate with this connection to the ports north of us, to the ports in New York, and the road and rail transportation is sort of an integrated whole, but we just don't have the mechanism for that.
I wonder if, in your view, that lobbyists and certain interest groups are actually, if they are more effective, or if you feel like they're more influential in shaping public policy at the local or the county level, because their issues tend to be a little bit different, but our issues tend to hit their wallets more, whether it's a real estate developer or something like that, versus the federal level, where it seems like lobbyists are more broadly ideologically based.
I think we're all influenced now. To what degree? We have these personal relationships with. There's actual former county legislators that have a lobbying practice, and they've met with me on behalf of their client Honeywell to try to make sure that we relax the tight, noose that we want to we want to have on them in their lake cleanup efforts. A lot of the engineering firms are very influential because of the contracts that are let to them. Is it more or less than the federal? I don't think so. It's prevalent everywhere. And one of the issues is, when we were talking about campaign finance, we all raise money from the same people. Somebody says, is it hard to ask somebody for money? Well, the universe of known donors is pretty defined. And so when I call Mr. Bandablu, I know he's given to the Congress, I know he's given to the state Senate, and I know that he's given to the local legislature, and so it's not that hard to ask. But, so those people have an influence. Professor.
Well,
Last question.
okay, thank you. I suppose we're, hypothetically speaking, some state where the Democrats controlled the legislature, and there was a Democratic governor, and they banded together and decided they were going to pass, that the public employees were woefully underpaid. So they were going to raise the salaries of public employees tenfold or so. This was going to have to be paid for by massive tax increases, and the majority of the people were convinced that this was going to cost all kinds of jobs. So in response, the Republican members of the legislature absented themselves from the state and decided they weren't going to come back and participate in this exercise in democracy, as some of us might say. But, so my question for you is, what about that? What do you think about the legislatures that leave the state to thwart the majority will of the legislature? You know, is it ever appropriate? Is it always appropriate? What kind of principle would guide your thinking in that regard?
I guess it depends on whose side you're on. And I say that quite seriously, because I think that's how the political world operates. And let me disappoint you by saying and admitting to you that we're doing something very similar to that on the local level. In Onondaga County, as I reviewed at lunch, during the lake cleanup process, when it began about 15 years ago, we signed what's called a project labor agreement, which basically says a couple things. It eliminates some of the burdensome state requirements that every component of a construction project be bid out, but it also mandates the use of local labor, particularly of the union kind. And we are at a point now where the original PLA has expired. And every Democrat on this legislature, we have not stood up and walked out, but because we want to extend this for reasons we could debate ad nauseum. Onondaga County's charter requires, I think, a 2/3 vote to pass a bonding resolution. And we need to pass another bonding resolution, and we have said no. Every month it comes before us, and they have the vote, and we say no. So we're doing essentially the same thing. And I think we'll have a compromise at some point, but it's the same thing as walking out and refusing to do the issue. So I guess it's whose ox is being gored. So I can't give you a general principle.
On that note, please join me in thanking
Thank you.
Tom Buckel.